Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here today, everybody. Author Steve Kemper in his new book, Our Man in Tokyo, An American Ambassador and the Countdown to Pearl Harbor. Fantastic book, really great conversation. Before we get to it, little bit of a plug for the History Nerds United social media stuff. Listen, everybody. You're listening to the podcast. You're like, hey, I like this stuff. There is more for you on the blog and on social media. 3 times a week on social media, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, I put out history nuggets. They're just these really small, quick bits of history just to get you thinking throughout the day, give you a little bit of excitement in the morning. So please follow us, leave comments on social media. Twice a week on the blog, I'm reviewing a book or sometimes a TV show. Netflix is killing it with the documentaries lately, I'm not going to lie to you. So listen, check those out. Please leave us comments, all of that stuff. I'm going to shut up about that stuff. Let's get to Steve Kemper. Book is amazing. All the stuff you didn't know about Japan right before World War II and Pearl Harbor. Let's talk to him now. And here we are, author Steve Kemper and his book, Our Man in Tokyo, An American Ambassador and the Countdown to Pearl Harbor. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, Steve, I did some research, found out where you were born. And this is a city that I know is very often mispronounced. Can you please tell me the name of the city that you were born in?
You mean Louisville, Kentucky?
That is not it, and you know it.
No, the way we pronounce it there is Louisville. Somebody once said it sounds like you have a couple of small stones in your mouth when you say that.
That's how it is explained to me. An East Coaster, I was stationed at Fort Knox for a few years, and it took me about 3 months, and then somebody said, pretend you have a few marbles in your mouth, and now say it, and then you'll pronounce it properly.
No, I'm sure a Yankee could still figure out a way to mispronounce it with marbles in his mouth.
Probably me by the end of this episode.
We'll try it. Let's see. Let's hear it.
Louisville.
There you go.
See, I got it. I'm not going to lose it now. I know it. So you are a freelance journalist. You write books, and it looks like you have written articles for a bunch of other places too. How did that kind of work out for you as far as getting to the point where you're writing books like this?
Well, I guess it worked out. I've never had a real full-time job in my life, and I've been doing this now for over 40 years, so I guess it's worked out. I went into books when magazine journalism sort of dried up after the recession. The advertising disappeared, magazines got thinner, newspapers started laying people off. There were fewer holes and more people trying to fill them, so I turned to books, and I'm glad I did.
And now, are you still writing articles for anybody? Because I've heard it's even worse out there now as far as finding anyone to write for, that it's even tighter than it used to be.
That's my understanding too, but fortunately I don't have anything to do with that and don't intend to.
Now, Our Man in Tokyo, about the American ambassador in Japan before World War II, Joseph C. Grew. How did you even stumble upon this story? Where'd you first see it?
Well, I read a book, maybe you're familiar with it, Eric Larson's a book called In the Garden of Beasts. And it's about the American ambassador to Germany in the early 1930s, just when Nazism and Hitler were starting to rise. And it was fascinating to watch this culture, this nation, start to go slowly insane. And after I finished it, I thought, well, who was our man in Tokyo? And that became the title of my book, and I looked into it. It was Joseph Clark Grew, and that's the seed. Sprouted from there.
And it sounds like he was pretty prolific as far as writing is concerned, because it seemed like you had a lot of stuff to pull from. Sometimes when you're talking about post-World Wars and things like that, a lot of stuff has gone missing. But he seemed to be pretty prolific about what he wrote down, what he was thinking. Was there a lot of information for you to pull from, or was it like pulling teeth?
No, it was wonderful. He kept a diary, and his Tokyo diary alone is 6,000 pages for the 10 years he was there. And then he also wrote speeches. He wrote, of course, thousands and thousands of dispatches to the State Department and thousands back to him. He also kept clipping books each year from the American newspapers and Japanese newspapers written in English and Japanese newspapers that had been translated into English, the important articles. So I had 10 years of newspaper clippings to go through as well. So there was a lot of material. I spent quite a long time in the Grew archive at Harvard, just taking pictures. That's all I did with my phone every day. Take a picture, turn the page, take a picture, turn the page. And I did that for 8 or 9 hours a day for almost a month. And then when I got home, I had I don't even want to think about it. Probably 12,000 pages of material to load into my computer and read. But it was wonderful. I'd much rather have too much material than too little.
And the way you portray him in the book, I'd have to think that he was pretty reliable as well. He seemed to be very upfront about what he was thinking, especially in the diary, it would seem. Did you find that everything else that you could find kind of aligned with what at least he was thinking and what he was observing?
Well, I found that he told the truth in his diary. He wasn't always right. He didn't always get everything right, and he admitted that when he, if it turned out to be something that he was wrong about, he admitted it, which I admired in him. And then, of course, there's different interpretations of different facts, different events. He was aware of that. But I never got the sense he was lying or trying to cover up or anything. So by the time I finished reading those 12,000 pages, I admired him more than I did when I started. And that's not always the case when you start looking into someone pretty deeply.
He's also probably very unique in that his love of Japan comes through the entire time. I mean, he's an American through and through, but he seems to really love Japan, the Japanese people, all the way through, even with what he kind of saw as this society starting to go down a very dark path.
Yeah, I think that's very perceptive of you to see that. He did love Japan. He said it was his favorite post, despite what happened there, and despite the fact that he was a failure as an ambassador, in his own words, because an ambassador's first job is to keep the peace. But he loved the Japanese people. He loved the Japanese culture. And that's partly why it's so poignant to read his letters and his dispatches. He saw this country that he loved going down this wrong path, and the people that wanted to stop it couldn't. The Japanese people. So it was, terrible for him and for his friends in Japan who did not want conflict with the West, but they were kind of helpless in the end.
I kind of came away with this, that your thesis for the book, kind of the backbone, is that Pearl Harbor, World War II, Japan joining the Axis and becoming belligerents was not a foregone conclusion. It was not like Germany once, Hitler started to roll, that it was going to be World War II. These things were going to happen. It felt like in the book that you were kind of pointing out, Japan was not as clear-cut as it was with Germany, that there were still people who had some power kind of fighting the entire time to keep from going to war, at least with the United States, I should say. China is a kind of a different story.
Yeah, it sure is. I think you're right about that. That certainly was Gru's impression, and I'm trying to tell the story through Gru's perspective. And so, yeah, he saw many diplomatic opportunities right up to the end, till near the end, where it may have been possible, in his view, to wedge something in there to either slow down the momentum toward war or to halt it. Whether he could have actually done that, I don't know. I'm telling a story as it was lived by the people who were living it. And Gru's impression to the end was, let's keep trying diplomacy. Let's don't give up. There's still an opportunity here. And there were a couple people on the Japanese side who also wanted that. Even the last foreign minister wanted to come to some accommodation, if possible, to avert what he knew was going to happen. That he had been, the military had told him, if you fail, the war is starting. And so he was getting more and more desperate as well. Gru didn't know that the attack was coming, but this foreign minister did. And so his efforts to come to some kind of understanding got more and more urgent. But the Japanese were very stubborn, and as well, they would only allow certain conditions before they would say, no, we can't do that. And then you're back on the path toward Pearl Harbor again. So it was frustrating for Gru all the way around.
I think a lot of Americans, we don't go over this in history class. Before Japan became belligerent with the U.S., they were just doing terrible, terrible things in China. Can you give just a little bit of background before, Japan is part of World War II against the U.S.? What's happening with Japan and China that kind of sets the stage for these arguments?
The Japanese army invaded Manchuria, a province of China, in 1931. The Japanese army did that without asking permission from the civilian government in Tokyo. So that was the start of it. And then they started creeping down into the northern provinces of China. And then they were sort of at an impasse near Beijing. And some young soldiers, Japanese soldiers, and some young Chinese soldiers took some pot shots at each other on patrol. And that suddenly escalated into this Second Sino-Japanese War, one of the most horrific wars of the century. Although you're right, we don't know much about it. I think the Japanese lost 500 to 700,000 people dead, soldiers dead. The Chinese lost for something like 10 million soldiers dead. And then the civilians were even more than that, because the Japanese war tactic began to be bombing civilian populations to make China submit. And so there were horrifying civilian casualties all over China. Everyone knows about the rape of Nanjing, one of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century. So those things were happening, and a lot of it wasn't getting that heavily reported for a while in the U.S., and then it did start getting reported, and it started to make the U.S. more and more disgusted with Japan, and started to crack the isolationist shell that we had been in. Of course, the main cracks were coming from the other side of the ocean. We saw a la Britain getting pounded by the Nazis, and that certainly cracked the egg too.
And is a lot of this not remembered as starkly as something like the Holocaust just because, well, I mean, it's a question that I've always kind of asked, is the rape of Nanking, as you were saying, Nanjing, I'm going to mispronounce it all over the place, but absolute atrocities, just horrible things happening. And as you said, we're talking about gigantic numbers here. But a lot of times when people are taught World War II, it seems like Japanese atrocities do not get the attention that the Nazis did. Do you have any thoughts about why that is, or is that just my perception being off?
I can give you a couple of speculative ideas. One is that most Americans don't know much about anything going on in Asia until Pearl Harbor happened. Our focus was Europe. We're Eurocentric. That's where most of the people in the United States came from. And so I think that's also part of the explanation about why it doesn't get covered as much. There's a racial component to it. There's no doubt about that to me. It wasn't as important. I can sort of back that up a little bit by looking at the 1924, what became known as the Exclusion Act, which forbid all immigration from Asia. People from Japan, China, Southeast Asia were not even allowed to immigrate here at all. And so that tells you something about the racial beliefs of most Americans at that time. Keep them over there, keep them out, and we're not going to go to war because of anything that's happening over there.
And it certainly gives you a frame of reference for perhaps we started out not on the best terms around this time period because of things like the Exclusion Act and saying very clearly, like, we don't want any of your people over here. You just stay on your side and we'll trade and we'll do this. But other than that, just leave us alone a bit.
Then there's the other side of it. We were Japan's main trading partner. I think 40% of their exports went to us and 30% of their imports came from us. So hugely important. There were financial ties, business ties, cultural ties. Baseball was hugely popular, for instance. American music was tremendously popular. There were American-style restaurants. English was a very popular language to learn in the schools. There was an English lesson on the radio every day. So there were movie stars. American movie stars were famous, and they were on the covers of magazines. Fashions were adopted from America by fashion-conscious Japanese. So there were all sorts of ties that bound us, and yet there were these insults in some ways that Japanese had to absorb as well. A lot of wealthy Japanese people sent their sons to American universities, to British universities. The Harvard baseball team came over to do exhibition in Tokyo, not only because baseball was so popular, but because there were so many Harvard grads in Tokyo that they had a big audience for it. So it's an interesting and peculiar relationship.
And Ambassador Grew steps into this, and tell me if I'm wrong, it basically seems like there's kind of three forces going on in the Japanese government, right? There's the civilian side of it, and then there's the army and the navy. And it seems like the army is just ready to go to war 24/7. It's okay that we're at war in China too. They're just kind of rattling the sabers the entire time, whereas Grew kind of seems to focus much on the civilian government and trying to do all of his work through there. Did I oversimplify it, or am I kind of on the right track?
Well, that's the ambassador's role. I mean, he had a military attaché and he had a naval attaché, and their job was to gather information for Grew about what was going on, what was being said, what were the rumors in the Army and the Navy. And so it wasn't Grew's place to approach military leaders. He wouldn't do that. He had to work through the foreign minister. That's what an ambassador does. I kind of lost myself in your question. You left out the palace, by the way, in terms of these centers of power. The divine emperor, who was the commander-in-chief and the head of state, and yet was not allowed to make any decisions because he was a god and therefore infallible. And so if you start letting him make decisions, oops, he's going to make some mistakes. So they don't let him do that. So he has all this power and no power. But nevertheless, what the emperor wanted and what his advisor said the emperor wanted carried a huge sway with the military and with the civilian government.
The emperor is the most interesting person here besides Gru because of everything you've said. Again, going back to what you learn kind of in high school and things like that. Oh, the Japanese, if we had to invade the Japanese islands, they were all going to die for the emperor and it was going to be a disaster and everything like that. And you in the book just point out all of these things, that he's kind of the emperor and he's a god, but God's not allowed to make decisions. And then you talk about him as a person as well, where he's not the strongest personality, but every now and again, he seems to kind of come out of his shell. Was he a really interesting person to kind of dig more into?
Yeah, of course he was. He's supposed to be the epitome of this nation. I mean, he's the godhead from which the Nippon race springs. And all Japanese felt that they were descendants of the first emperor sent by the sun goddess. So that they had this drop of divinity in them coming through their relation to the emperor. So he's fascinating. And this is a pretty tough burden to put on this shy, bookish man who preferred to study marine organisms in his lab. And yet he's responsible for this imperial kingdom. And that's what the military took advantage of. He was the commander-in-chief. They were outside of the civilian government, answerable only to the emperor. Therefore, anything that they did was for the emperor's sake, for the good of the emperor, for the good of the nation. Who could fight with that? It's patriotic. We're doing it for Japan and for our God. You can get in a lot of trouble there, with that kind of attitude.
You point out, too, that was a somewhat new way of looking at things, right? That he was a god and the Nippon race and everything like that. That wasn't something that they've been saying for 3,000-4,000 years. That was a kind of new idea for Japan, right?
The story was only about a century old by this point, but all Japanese believed it. So it doesn't matter how old it was. It was absolute foundational belief.
Now, the important thing is there's a lot of very intense, serious things going on. And our hero, Joseph Gru, he had the full backing from the American government, right? They were replying to him on time. They were giving him clear orders, right? Like they were totally behind him the whole time, right?
You're leading me on there, huh?
A little bit.
Yeah. At some points they were, and at many points they were not. Gru was frustrated sometimes, and more so as the 30s wore on, by the non-response that he would get from the State Department. Because he would advise things, suggest things, ask questions about things because he knew things that the government did not know. And the government tended to ignore him despite his experience and his knowledge of being on the spot. Now, later on in the 30s, actually in 1941, early 1941, we cracked the Japanese diplomatic code. And so Hull and FDR were reading cable, all the cable traffic, diplomatic cable traffic between Tokyo and Washington, Tokyo and Berlin. Gru didn't know that. They were afraid to tell Gru that they had broken this code because they didn't know if the Japanese had broken our code, and they couldn't afford to give away this massively helpful secret. And at that point, it becomes more understandable why they might start to ignore what Gru had to say and what he thought, because they felt like they knew more than Gru did, and in many ways they did, but they didn't know everything. It's just such a complicated, squishy, thing that was happening during the late 1930s and early 1940s.
Gru seems through the book to take a lot of that in stride, but from his actual diaries, how pissed off did he get sometimes? I mean, did he really kind of let loose and get super annoyed about what was going on, or did he kind of understand he'd had to play the game?
No, first of all, he was in his own words, a loyal soldier. He would never criticize his government to the Japanese, for instance, to the Japanese government or to Japanese people, not even to his embassy employees, his embassy staff. He understood their frustrations. He shared them. But he said, those things do not leave this embassy. We can talk about that among ourselves, but it doesn't go anywhere. So he was very loyal, and he was very vigilant about presenting American policy as it was given to him to present, and not saying, well, I don't agree with it, but here it is. He didn't do that. In his diary, he was very circumspect, very diplomatic. He would never get, as you put it, pissed off. He never got pissed off, as far as I could tell. He would get frustrated and express that frustration, but not in a way that was bitter or even angry. It was just more puzzlement than anything. He was a very cool customer.
Is there anything he could have done differently, or do you think there's anything he should have done differently? Because I walked away from this saying it may not have been inevitable, but there was only so much he could do from his position. Did you have any thoughts about that as you were writing it, or did you just stick to here's what happened?
I think that, that was Gru's impression too. When Pearl Harbor happened, he spent 6 months writing what he called his final report, the 6 months during which he was interned in the embassy as a prisoner of war in Tokyo while they were negotiating the release of diplomats on both sides. He analyzed what had happened, why it had happened, and he came to the conclusion that he really couldn't have done anything else. He didn't think he had left anything, unexplored that might have changed something. That doesn't mean he thought that our government hadn't left a few things unexplored. He did think that, but he felt good about his own role, bad about the failure of his mission.
You make the point that honor is a real problem for Japan, where usually honor is a good thing. It seems that for the Japanese, it put them in this position because there are multiple people on the Japanese side who sat there and said, yeah, if we go to war with the U.S., we're probably going to lose. We're in a bad spot here, and yeah, maybe something might work out pretty nice. But when this all happened, there was not a small amount of people, a lot of people on the Japanese side who said, we're going to lose.
Yeah, they did war games, and every time they did a war game, and this was a number of times in the last couple of years before Pearl Harbor, they could last a year, at the most 2 years, and then the crushing resources of the United States would overwhelm them. And that's why their plan was strike fast, cripple the Pacific Fleet, make the U.S. understand that they have to come to the table and negotiate, and that's the way we're going to get to keep China and Southeast Asia. We have to strike fast and win fast, or we're doomed. And yet they did it anyway. I mean, and it showed a complete lack of understanding of American psychology, which Gru kept trying to tell them. He kept trying to tell the Japanese, you think that we're a nation of isolationists and pacifists because all you're reading are your censored news reports and your censored media. And they only quote the pacifist. You don't understand how much anger is building up over in America. And when America throws off its sheepskin, that lion is going to come roaring out at you and you're going to be done. And he kept telling the American side, you think Japan's a little nation and they will never dare to attack us. But you don't understand the fanaticism and the imperial dreams that these people have. And they're capable of anything. And it might happen. That's what happens when you're listening to both sides and seeing both sides and neither side's paying much attention to you.
Something else I think that is really overlooked in this time period is it wasn't like the Japanese had actually joined the Axis power the day before Pearl Harbor and started attacking. They'd actually joined the Axis powers well before that, but were a non-belligerent nation, right?
Well, they were a very belligerent nation. They just weren't willing to be belligerent on Hitler's behalf. Yeah, that was one of the things that surprised me. I grew up thinking that Germany and Japan were tight partners. And in fact, Japan resisted much of Germany's desire for them to join the European war. Japan had its own agenda. It didn't want to get sucked into a European war. It just wanted to pluck off the colonies in Asia for itself. So it flirted with Japan. It loved totalitarianism. The military was crazy about Hitler and the German army and those victories. The Blitzkrieg was just astonishing to them. Gru said it went to their head like strong wine. But on the other hand, they did not want Hitler calling the shots. If I invade Britain, you have to join in. No, the Japanese said, no, we'll decide that on our own when the time comes, because they didn't want Hitler to determine what they did. That was news to me.
You also point out that It was hard for the Japanese to realize how bad a cocktail working with Germany was because, of course, Hitler's running around saying if you're not a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white person, you're gonna die. And yet, Japan joins with Germany. And you point out in the book, which I love this, they just took those parts out of like Mein Kampf, right? So the Japanese people are like, oh no, this sounds perfectly fine, right?
That's true. It was a bowdlerized version of Mein Kampf that got published in Japan. But the Japanese understood Mein Kampf because they had the same megalomania about themselves in Asia. They thought they were the superior race in Asia, and therefore they deserved to rule Asia. So they understood that sort of psychology.
So one of the things that I like to ask authors, especially about something like this, something that you do think you learn in high school in these places and things like that. People think history is boring, right? I learned that already. They made me learn it every year. We went over the same stuff all of the time. I'm not going to read history in my free time. It's boring. If somebody was sitting in front of you and said, hey, Our Man in Tokyo, I already know this man. Why should I bother reading it? What would you say?
Well, I would say that if history is boring, you haven't read the right books of history and you haven't used your imagination to understand what history is. It's not dead. It's not like, you turn the page on a year and all that stuff just stays in the closet. Just this morning, I read in the paper that Poland is deeply suspicious of a gift of armaments that Germany wants to give them to help fight Ukraine. Because Poland is never going to not be deeply suspicious of Germany because Germany invaded them on September 1st, 1939. It's just the way history is. That's history coming back. I mean, you look at Africa, you look at Bosnia, you look any place you want to glance, history is rearing its head. So to me, it's helpful if you understand what all those heads are, because it's Cerberus. I mean, it's everywhere. So if your politicians are advocating censorship and they're saying sedition is okay, and they're saying that we have to educate only certain people in certain things and leave out other things. If the media is telling you lies, it's misinformation. It's not based upon fact. It's based upon ideology. These are kind of important things to realize that they've happened in the past and look where they've gone. And if you can recognize that and understand it, maybe you can keep it from happening to you. And the other thing to keep in mind is that history is not this dead thing. History was made by people who were living. They were passionate. They were driven by their agendas and their ideas and their perspectives. And their plans got blown up because that's what happens to plans. And it went in a different direction. And it's dramatic. I mean, there's not much more dramatic than some of these things that I'm writing about, that historians write about. They're big events. They help to shape our lives, the future. And if you make them boring, I don't know how you even do that. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make dead people come alive. I was a journalist for many decades, and I'm basically doing the same thing now, except I'm doing it with dead people. What did it feel like? What was it like? What were you thinking? What happened? Why? How did you react? That's the stuff of drama, conflict, human psychology, and it never changes. That's part of the problem with history. We keep going around in the spiral.
Well, Steve, Our Man in Tokyo, absolutely loved it. Everybody should read it. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
And that's it for this episode. Steve, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Go out, get Our Man in Tokyo. You're going to love it, nerds. I already plugged all of our social media, so I'm not going to do it again. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay cool, nerds.